Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. This week we have we're going to discuss the book Gender Critical Feminism, which is going to be published on the 12th of May this year, 2022. The book is by Holly Lawford-Smith, and today we're really lucky to have Holly Lawford-Smith herself, the author, and Caroline Norma and me discussing this book. And we'll put in the chat. There's where you can get the book, and also there's a sort of 30% off code for it. So welcome to our panelists, Holly Lawford-Smith and Caroline Norma, and welcome to everybody online, all the attendees who's here. So to introduce the book, Gender Critical Feminism. It's by Holly Lawford-Smith. It's published on the 14th of May by Oxford University Press. It's fantastic that one of the top academic publishers has taken this step, and it will be available widely in university libraries to academics and students worldwide. So it could become a key text in women's studies, gender studies, and in philosophy, political theory. It will also be widely read, I imagine, by academic activists engaged in the defense of women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. Holly Lawford-Smith has a website which will you can find, just Google Holly Lawford-Smith. She, on the website, it says, "I'm an associate professor in political philosophy in the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies in the University of Melbourne. I work in," well, this is Holly. Holly works in social, moral, and political philosophy with a particular interest in feminism, climate ethics, and collective action. Most of Lawford-Smith's current research is centered on the conflict of interest between gender identity activism on the one hand, and both women's rights and lesbian, gay, and bisexual rights on the other hand. She adds, "Around work, I do some campaigning for the protection of women's sex-based rights." Holly Lawford-Smith is on the editorial board of the Journal of Political Philosophy and the Journal of Controversial Ideas. And there's lots of really interesting stuff on her website. So if you want to follow up, apart from getting the book and reading it, there's lots of interesting stuff on the website. So to get us started about the book, I'm going to hand over to Caroline Norma, who's going to talk about the book, and then also sort of pose a few questions to Holly. And then later on, I'm going to take a radical feminist perspective on the book and ask some questions or make some points from that perspective. So over to you, Caroline.
Thanks, Jo. And I think Jo's right in saying that Holly has given us a book that's usable and will be functional and a tool for us in our movement. And I'll just run through, I know you want to hear from Holly Lawford-Smith, I'll run through the structure just to give you a sense of just how functional the book is. And what Holly has done for us is produced a book that's in two parts with an introduction prefacing it, and then a manifesto, or what she calls a coda. Had to look up that word coda, thanks Holly, but it's a manifesto at the end there, which is also very useful, and I'll mention that the contents of that in a minute. So Holly starts out the book by showing us where feminism as a broad political movement has common ground, and then at the end of that chapter where it doesn't. That's the introduction. And then the two parts is the first part is what is gender critical feminism for the book, and then the second part is hard questions for gender critical feminism. And then the book is divided into 10 chapters. The first chapter gives an explanation of the radical feminism second wave. So Holly is keen to tell us about where the roots of the specific movement that she ends up describing in the book, where the roots are in terms of political movement and its literature. And then in the second chapter is about gender critical feminism itself. So this is the one everyone's racing to get to once they pick up the book, and I certainly was. So that's a very clear, comprehensive definition and discussion of where Holly thinks and why Holly thinks a gender critical feminism is necessary as a progression, evolution from radical feminism. And then Holly, but then at that point, Holly has a very substantial chapter on the sex industry, including pornography and other forms of sexual exploitation of women and girls. And this chapter really is persuasive for giving us the sense that gender critical feminism goes beyond the transgender issue, but considers all of radical feminism's insights in relation to it. And then is the chapter on trans/gender, is its title, trans/gender, and that's where we see the application of gender critical feminism to those issues. And interestingly, Holly starts out there by talking about so-called trans men and the solidarity that we need to have with them. Then leading into the hard questions for gender critical feminism. Before that, we've got, is gender critical feminism trans exclusionary? And then, is gender critical feminism intersectional? So I'll have a question for Holly about that in a minute. And the chapter 8 after that is gender critical feminism feasible? And then chapter 9, is gender critical feminism liberal? Is gender critical feminism liberal? And then at the end, we come to Holly's gender critical manifesto, which is a list of 50 or more demands for an end to male violence against women and girls, divided into 5 different categories of demands in relation to our sex-based rights. So yeah, it's a real packs a punch, and it's a really interesting winning book. So if I can ask Holly my first question, let's go to Holly now finally. What prompted you to begin writing Gender Critical Feminism, out this month from Oxford University Press, in 2019?
I had to look this up because I did not at all remember. So I was doing some research last night on myself. And I found out that I contacted Oxford University Press pitching the idea for the book the day after my first cancellation. So 3 AM magazine had interviewed me as a philosopher about my work and about all of my interests. But at the very end, they had asked some questions about trans issues, which I had been kind of outspoken about politically and had started writing on, but I think I only had like 2 papers in draft or something. So there was a little bit of content there about what my views were. And then I think the people complained, and then the journal or magazine pulled the interview, and then the interviewer quit in protest. So I sort of woke up one morning in Australia to this huge set of events that had happened, and that was my first experience of being kind of deplatformed. So it was immediately after that I must have thought, oh, this is an interesting issue and people care about it and it's causing a fuss, and so it all went from there. Yeah. Well,
thank God it did, and we can thank our counsellors for giving us the impetus to get on and do things. So that's a silver lining. Great, Holly, thank you. That's very interesting. You encourage readers to become gender critical feminists as part of a contemporary social movement, an evolved one that has evolved out of radical feminism, as you write, but leaves behind its historical experiments and confusions in various ways, in order to better address the circumstances that we find ourselves in now. So obviously the big question that everyone's going to be waiting for, how do you define gender critical feminism?
Yeah, so in the book I define gender critical feminism as a theory and a movement that takes women to be a sex caste. And in doing that, I take it to be a direct descendant of radical feminism. The sex part is really important. So that's the naming of femaleness and what has been done to female people. But the caste part is really important too. So it says that women have been / are still oppressed. And it puts their oppression on a par with other kinds of groups that had been theorized prior, like class and race, in deserving a serious kind of attention and analysis. And one thing that I do in the book, which might be something that causes some disagreement with some radical feminists, I think, is that I give a really minimalist definition of radical feminism and of gender critical feminism as continuing that project. Like, it's literally just sex caste. And then from there, you can ask all these really interesting questions, which the rad fems already started doing. So you can ask about the origins or explanations of women's oppression. You can ask about the mechanisms by which this kind of oppression is perpetrated or sustained. And you can start dreaming about the feminist utopia, right, where women are liberated or women have equality, or these sorts of problems are overcome. But I see all that as just puzzles that we are all trying to work out and solve together, rather than sort of attaching radical feminism or gender critical feminism to like a particular thinker's way of conceiving that movement. So that was a sort of motivation for being able to unify it all a little better and to give us a kind of common project across the years. And I think maybe just one more comment on that. I think the definition, that minimalist definition in terms of sex caste, it is helpful in setting gender critical feminism apart from some other types of feminism. So definitely from intersectional feminism, because that kind of feminism will absolutely refuse to address sex alone, right? Whereas gender critical feminism will not. It addresses sex and it tries to think about what it means to talk about women as women. And then maybe there's one other thing that sets it apart, but I think maybe we'll probably get to talk about this a bit later on. It's just that I think gender critical feminism is also distinguished from liberal feminism in the sense that there's a real disagreement over autonomy, which is to say over the extent to which what it would take to make women free, right? So I think that liberal feminism thinks that you just have to release some constraints, right? Like change some laws, change some policies, change her opportunities, and then she will be fully free or she will flourish. And I think the rad fem tradition, and I think the gender critical tradition in agreement with it, think it goes a lot deeper than that, that you could change all those things and she would still be as she has been constructed to be. And so there's much more work to be done in kind of throwing off that socialization or that oppression. So I think that's another sort of very deep disagreement between this kind of feminism and at least some other kinds. Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer, but it is the core of the project, I guess.
It is, and the most fascinating bit, yeah, from my perspective too, I know we'll talk about it much later as well. Also, perhaps I think in one sentence I read that it's kind of a departure from understanding the oppression of women or male supremacy as infecting every last aspect of societies down to the last molecule, that kind of discussion perhaps, yeah, we can have later too. But yeah, you say, this book is very interesting because it's a movement, I think it's primarily a movement building book. I got that impression. It attempts to find common ground, to sort of minimise differences in order to prioritise commonalities so that we can move forward as a movement, because our success is the only thing that's important, obviously. It's women's lives are at stake. But on the other hand, no one should think of it as a Pollyanna book either, I don't think, and I didn't, because you get into the discussion of intersectionality. And so, yeah, my next question is, obviously the book, central to the book, the central claim of the book is the need for feminists to restrict their activism to issues of sexism that affect women as women, rather than issues that affect women as a result of membership in other groups, for example, women, disability, discrimination, employment. Probably for some radical feminists too, even, maybe this argument will be difficult to accept, but do you want to talk more about that argument?
Sorry, can you say a little more? You mean the...
Oh, sorry, it's Holly. Yes, I've gone round and round, but maybe the book's recommendation against intersectionality, or the book's arguments that it provides for how we might critique and resist the imperatives of intersectionality.
Mm-hmm.
How do you justify that, given that we're all, keen on being anti-racist and all the rest of it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think this is really my, again, this is just kind of really clearly relates to this idea of feminism as being about sex caste. So I think I really want a narrowing of the current sort of mainstream feminist agenda, which I think partly has become extremely bloated because of intersectional theory. And again, we can argue about whether it's because of complete distortions of the correct understanding of what intersectional theory should be, or whether it is intersectional theory and its proponents itself. There's definitely a philosophical discussion to be had there. But I think regardless of what you think about that, the effect has been that the current movement has either shifted to being feminism for everybody, which means about every issue for every person, which means it's just a general social justice movement, global justice movement called feminism, which I think, global justice is fine, but calling it feminism so everyone thinks there's heaps of feminism being done, that's the thing where there's a bit of a rip-off for women, right? So we've got that problem. And we've also got, even for the women who don't conceive it as a movement for everybody about everything, they still tend to focus on the idea of feminism as a movement for women as people. And you can sort of see where that comes from, right? It's like, okay, if my movement is for Tuvaluans, then I'm going to care about the welfare of the Tuvaluan people holistically, right? So it's not a mad interpretation by any means. But I think that was McKinnon's insight in the second wave as well, that feminism should be about women as women. And there's theoretical work to be done to figure out exactly what that means. It's not entirely obvious, but it's not like just because a woman happens to be poor or just because a woman happens to face these medical issues as an individual. It's like there's a cluster of issues somehow to do with her sex and the way that she has been treated throughout time on the basis of that sex. The construction of femininity into which she is pushed. That stuff, I think, is core women as women stuff. And I think once you really conceptualize that and have a clear sense of that, it gives you the resources to resist this kind of bloated agenda that has come out of intersectional theory and this kind of inclusive feminist movement. So that I'm really trying to refine the feminist project in the book down to a manageable set of core issues around sex caste.
Oh, I think you're being modest there, Holly, because I think, from my reading of the book at least, Holly in this book gives us finally the arguments I think we need to defend ourselves against and to push back against this is entirely my interpretation, not what Holly wrote in the book, but this anti-feminist movement that is attempting to guilt trip women for concentrating on ourselves and our own class and our own liberation of that class, such as, and I've mentioned this book before, but Feminism for the 99%. You've got to be kidding. That book is an anti-feminist book who attempts to blackmail and, emotionally sort of trick, young women, targets young women to not focus on ourselves. I think that's frankly, I think that's the upshot of intersectionality, but that's certainly not, Holly's arguments are sort of way more thought out and, really philosophically sensible, which I thought was, but that gives us tools. That's really good. We don't have to get all emotional about it. We can actually have nice arguments from this book, which was good. Okay, sorry, on to, I think I'll make this maybe the last question to be time for Joe in discussion. Okay, sorry, I'm just choosing which one.
I think we're fine for time. It's only 20 past 10.
Okay. Oh, okay, good. You discuss prostitution and pornography at length in the book, more than I expected, actually, and it's a really thorough, deep discussion too. But obviously, maybe when, particularly rad femmes picking up the book might expect it to be all about transgenderism and the movement to resist that. So why was prostitution and pornography so central to your discussion of gender-critical feminism?
Yeah. This was again, just trying to go back and think about the continuity, which I really think there is between the gender critical feminist movement and the earlier radical feminist movement. The thing that I said earlier about sort of looking at all of their projects and then trying to find a sort of loose, unifying, minimalist explanation of what they were doing and what they were struggling with, what the project is. Then sort of what are the central issues today that kind of concern sex caste. And then that's sort of why it ended up being that two of the core problems that the book takes up afresh in some sense philosophically is the sex industry and what's going on with trans ideology at the moment. It's not that they're the most important issues on the feminist agenda once you look at, my version of the agenda or the Women's Declaration's version of the agenda or Women's Place UK's, so it's not that I've gone and chosen the most important or the issues that cause the most harm to women necessarily. It's that I wanted the representative sense of something that the rad femmes in the second wave were really concerned with, which was pornography. And there was a large consensus on those issues for a while. And then obviously to choose something that we are really concerned with now, which is the trans issue, but to try to assess both of them as concerns with sex cast. So you'll see that in the chapters, I was really preoccupied with harm to women. That was just the guiding question. So what in the sex industry, where are the harms to women? Obvious answers to that. And then same, you mentioned I had a kind of preoccupation with trans men, right? So it's like, what's happening with trans issues and where are women being harmed in that? And it's the women on the inside, and it's also the women on the outside who had a coherent feminist analysis of gender, and that is being overturned. But we can overlook the women on the inside that are being harmed too, right? Which is the trans men. So that was the motivation, like push again that theory of feminism as a focus on sex cast, try to think about some core issues, try to represent issues that were paradigmatic for the earlier movement and our movement, and then try to do some fresh theorizing about them. And that's really something I hope that people, like it's my hope that people might take away from the book, that even if they came to gender critical feminism not as feminists, right? Even if they just had a gut sense that something was really wrong with what these men at the moment are demanding, that they might nonetheless discover that the roots and explanation of what they're angry about, right, are feminist. Like the man just claiming to be a woman because of some identification with a stereotype that he happens to have, identifying with man's ideas about what women are. The resistance to that is feminist, right? And it's like, but it might need some filling in. And from there, once you recognize that, I think you're now in a way that you can see a broad range of feminist issues. So when we win the fight against this silly gender ideology, gender identity ideology, they might then be in a position to start really being interested in some other thing. Maybe they're working on justice in the birth world after that, right? Or one of the many other hundreds of interesting issues where we need strong female voices. So that's like my, I don't know, best case scenario, that people sort of like find feminism through this, even if they didn't come to it as feminists.
Exactly right. And I think that approach, was really good, because surely the most likely constituency we currently have in the whole world is this group of women who are rising up due to, perhaps, sometimes kind of mixed up and vague, protestations against what they're seeing happening at this kid's school, or, and fair enough, they can't be fully sorted out about the theory of it all. But when we're talking about kind of, raising a movement, organising women, as in, the Marxist type of organising women, we have to, be aware of our constituencies. And surely this one of all is going to be the one, because, like you're saying there, Holly, they're the ones, they are objecting to something, that they're feeling insult to their, to their class, to be honest, in my terms, or their caste, that they're feeling that insult personally. Let's work with that. I mean, it's just
exactly.
In some ways, it's a great opportunity, but not a great opportunity either. Great. And this next question, Holly, probably has something a little bit in common with Shelley Jeffries' book as well, in that you're keen to, for gender critical feminist groups in the real world or online, the organised face of gender critical feminism, for these groups to have members who engage in the groups and participate in them on an equal footing, without some of the kind of hierarchies that align with the intersectionality type ideology of prioritising women over other women, that we know well from these leftist groups that are going on. But how do you think that this would make the movement more politically effective if we do kind of try to hold to that rule or a philosophy?
Yeah, I think it would make it more efficient, because we would all have a clearer sense of what our constituency is and what's within the bounds of what our issues are. So I think this relates to the earlier thing we were talking about with the bloated agenda that comes from intersectionality. And again, this is really going to depend on theorizing more than I have done in the book, exactly what is inside the lines of women as women, rather than women as people. And Kate Phelan and I talk about this a little more in a separate paper we have on intersectionality. But it's really that concept, once we understand that, we are all equals. That's really important. As women, in a movement that cares about women as women, we are all equals. So there is no difference politics. You don't get any of that stuff that you have when you're really doing standpoint theory combined with intersectional deference to the least well off, where you have to kind of constantly juggle within the group. There's almost always like a winner who is the most oppressed, who everyone else has to defer to. And I actually think that is really inegalitarian. It's disrespectful to that person, as though they can't handle robust disagreement, right? Like it sort of treats them as though, okay, you have all these marginalized identities, then what, therefore you can't be wrong, therefore we can't take you seriously as a person who we can have robust critical debate with. So these rules that are all set up at the moment, which are supposed to be, you know, I think some of them are well-intentioned. They're supposed to be correcting old hierarchies or sort of making ad hoc reparations for past injustices socially. But I think they create hierarchy, which we're supposed to be opposed to. So I think it will make feminist groups more efficient if we know what we're about, we know what we're there for, and we know that we are equals when it comes to being women as women. All we have to be is female. And then we focus on those issues and work on them together. And I do think this has caused trouble, you know, because people want to be kind and they want to be, you know, not able, what is the word, ableist or whatever. So then if a person with a disability says something, this should be on our feminist agenda, but it's actually a disability issue that they have in common with men, you have to be a really ovaries of steel type woman to challenge that person and say that's a disability issue, right? But I think maybe if we have a clear sense that we've come to agree on in the movement about what our issues are, it won't be so hard for that one woman to say, oh, I actually think that's a separate thing. No offense to you, you're still fully respected and included, but that's just not what we're about. That's what I'm trying to do.
And for the women themselves too. I mean, if they know about the frameworks from the start, I mean, yeah, we stand to gain women who are alienated or not served, or, you know, yes, refugees from those other groups that don't necessarily serve their interests either. It's amazing that, yeah, we're the endlessly intersectional ones, but other groups aren't, and therefore, you know, they're, so it's not bad to have that as kind of a selling point, yeah, for the groups that we create. I think that's great. Okay, getting on to the next question now. Probably this is the most difficult part of the book for me, just through the things that I've written and researched in the past. But and I understand why. In chapter 9, Holly Lawford-Smith gives a little bit of time in the book to the idea that we might be a little bit more accommodating of the idea that gender critical feminism has a liberal aspect, and we might be a bit more respectful of sort of ideas of liberal freedom, individual sort of self-determination and that kind of thing. So yeah, I was a bit surprised to see kind of a bit of an exploration into liberalism in a gender critical feminist book. But yeah, why was that there, Holly?
I sort of struggled with this a lot because I didn't know whether I was responding to a terminological issue or a real issue. So you know how like a lot of our disagreement is always phrased on Twitter, right, or in the forums as being radfems versus libfems, right? And I don't know, is that just a name for two positions that have nothing to do with liberalism and radicalism? Or is there some sort of distorted version of both of those movements tracking through to the feminist disagreement? So I just sort of ended up having this question, given that we tend to be in opposition to the libfems, how much, to what extent is that actually that we are in opposition to liberalism properly understood, you know, as a political philosopher or a political scientist would understand it. And I don't know if that's just me who's curious about that. Maybe I just like subject people to my weird problems that no one else really cares about, but I was really interested in that. And so I ended up approaching it by trying to figure out, you know, the sort of classical liberal set of values. Sorry, maybe another thing to say, because I think some people are probably thinking it, is that one way to carve that distinction is just to go reformers versus revolutionaries. And I think if you do that, you can make absolute sense of what's going on there, because just the reformers are the ones that want to sort of gradually change the law, but roughly work within the system. And the revolutionaries want to burn it all to the ground, right? And so in that sense, I think you can map, yeah, the libfems want to change the law and the radfems want the complete destruction of the male-built system or something. I don't know, put it dramatically how you like. But I didn't go that way. What I wanted to do was look at what are the fundamental value commitments of liberalism, and where, if at all, does gender critical feminism disagree with any of them? And this was the thing that ended up taking me to this question about autonomy. How deep does women's oppression go? And so I ended up thinking, no, actually, we kind of are all liberals, but there is this outstanding question where maybe a lot of the liberals tend to think, yeah, you just change her opportunities and her education and the law, and then she is free. Whereas I think a lot of the radicals tend to think, no, you have to do an awful lot of consciousness raising and effortful work and undoing of female socialization, and there'll be backsliding. And it's like a really hard thing to unwind that kind of socialization process. It's not that you've oppressed her and she knows it. It's that you have made her feminine and she is now feminine, right? And so there's this deep question. And again, this is just a complexity that probably almost no one cares about, but I found interesting. I think one of the philosophers who was very influential in discussing autonomy inside philosophy, I reckon she is actually a rad fem, but she thinks herself a liberal feminist. And so she brought radical ideas in, but called them liberal, and then defended that the liberal framework can accommodate these thoughts about autonomy. And so it's like, if that's what you think is going on, then actually there is this deep disagreement between the liberals and the radicals about autonomy, but we've got some mislabeling going on of which ideas count under which umbrella. That's all kind of messy, but it's just to say, mostly we're liberal, but there's this there's this kind of thing to be worked out about how unfree women are. Yeah.
I'm just going to check. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. My laptop sort of melted down. It's too hot in Britain. We can't cope. A little bit of sun. So I'm on something else. Can I come in now? Is it an okay time for me to come in with some of the radical feminist perspective things?
Perfect timing, Jo.
Okay, perfect. And sorry if I sort of contradict anything that's been said, because I just was off for about 10 minutes. So one of the things that happens in the book that's really fantastic, that in gender critical feminism, is that Holly, her bibliography references loads and loads of our history, of radical feminist history. So in the M segment, for instance, we've got Millett, Moore, that's is it Suzanne Moore, who's written recently, and Moran, Rachel Moran. So it's sort of rooted in radical feminist. And in the L's, we've got Lippmann, very modern, the researcher who's been cancelled. Locke, great, so that's a philosopher from the past, liberal Enlightenment philosopher. Lord, Audre Lorde. Lowry, Kathleen Lowry, who's a sort of academic. Finn McKay, who wrote the book Radical Feminism, and McKinnon. So this is like really refreshing, because it's one of the first books that we've got on this, in this area, which actually references some radical feminists and philosophers, and intertwines, like has a clear knowledge of radical feminism, very profound knowledge of radical feminism, unlike some of the other authors who have written really significant books. In the J section, there are 4 references to Sheila Jeffreys, but one thing I don't appreciate, and I think radical feminists will really question, is you have not referenced Gender Hurts, the most important book published on this topic recently, in 2014. So this is a big worry, because some readers, I mean, this is going to be read significantly all over the world, might not, you know, books are sort of a portal into other books often. You know, this is what we do as feminists or radical feminists. And a lot of people will now think that Gender Hurts was not published, and won't realize that this is unbelievably important. And it also doesn't reference anything by Julia Long. She's not mentioned in the bibliography. And you might say it's only YouTube stuff because she hasn't actually published stuff, but there are quite a lot of YouTube references. And she's made some very significant contributions philosophically to radical feminism. And then also Kara Dansky's Abolition of Sex and Ruth Barrett's Female Erasure. None of these, they're all very modern and really important. So that's a question, why didn't you reference them?
Yeah. Fair questions, absolutely fair questions, which I also knew that I would get, not those, but I think there's more to read than I was able to read. And so I was very conscious of the likelihood of missing things out that I should have talked about, and then sort of, you know, that just being the case. Kara Dansky's book came out well after this book was already going through the motion. So I don't think I would have been able to reference that. There was nothing principled about Julia Long. That's just, it wasn't. Jeffries, I think, and now I don't know if this is, I'll tell you what I was conscious of, and then, yeah, I think it would be fine to argue about it a bit. But what I wanted to not do and deliberately didn't do was take up this claim that I hear a lot in the gender critical movement, that because we are about gender identity ideology, our founding texts are Janice Raymond's Transsexual Empire and Sheila Jeffries' Gender Hurts, and these feminists who have done work on trans directly. And because I wanted to reject that claim, no, Raymond was a rad femme. She wrote all these books, and we're looking at the continuity between this movement, radical feminism, and today's preoccupation with gender experimentalism, or whatever you want to call it. It was really important to me to go back to the early radical feminist texts and sort of build the history that way. And so there was this whole middle period where, like, even books that were later in the development of radical feminism, like in the late 80s, early 90s, some of those aren't in there.
So, I mean, that might be your rationale, but from my point of view, I feel as if quite often in the book you say radical feminists said this and they believed this. It's the past tense, and a fair representation of our current ideas is completely missing, and that's a real problem, because I feel as if we're now going to be, our views are as if radical feminism has disappeared and it's the historical thing, and you're sort of saying that the new thing is gender critical, which it absolutely isn't. So from a rad fem perspective, we're very much alive and kicking, and our views are real, and they're very different from this gender critical stuff, and we've articulated them. So I feel as if it would have been, because you've sort of really criticized the trans ideology to some extent, but you haven't given us you've used radical feminism as a basis, and you've said that it's it's the roots of gender critical, but you haven't actually given us and said, oh, and by the way, there are loads of articulate radical feminists who exist right now, and in the, like, say, well, I mean, one thing I think is a really important thing is the Julia Long's 2021 speech, The Importance of Language When Talking About Transgenderism, or her 2021 speech, The Shortcomings of Mainstream Gender Critical Feminism. Those were both available, and they're absolutely bang on this topic. They're sort of, so it's like saying we've got, there isn't that side of it. You've just gone for your side, which So what happened with that?
No, I think that's just, I think I have to just take that criticism on the chin that I was historicizing radical feminism to some extent. I think that's just a fair criticism. I think I have gone back to the start, really tried to understand the sort of early development of the movement, and then presented that almost as though it's archived, and then looked at what we're doing today, which I think does look back to those texts, try to, I think some gender critical feminists do identify as and see themselves as radical feminists and in that tradition. But I think it's definitely right that I wasn't conscious of representing the live and continuing radical feminist tradition and trying to work out if and how there are differences with the gender critical movement as we understand it. So I think that's just a fair criticism.
Another criticism is that you, at one stage, you call, on page 71, you called Megan Murphy a radical feminist, and she doesn't say she's a radical feminist. And then later on, you call Julia Long on page 119, you call Kelly J. Keane Munchell a gender critical feminist, and Julia Long a gender critical feminist. And I think they're not going to be happy about that. Unless, so what I just think that's a mistake to go. I don't think either of them are going to call themselves, well, I don't think Meghan Murphy says she's a radical feminist. Kelly J doesn't say she's a feminist at all. She rejects gender critical feminism because she thinks it's too soft and wishy-washy, and then Julia Long, absolutely. So what about that? How's that come?
There are notes in the book. I can't remember if it's footnotes or if I just say their own labels aside, but there are definitely footnotes where I explain this. And one of the reasons for that, I think we can get on board with, as given our interactions with the gender identity movement, which is to say, in a sense, your commitments reveal what you are, not your self-preferred labels. So I think Meghan Murphy's collected work make her a radical feminist, whether she wants to call herself a radical feminist or not. And I think looking at Kelly J's early YouTube videos around the GRA consultation, again, absolutely reveal her commitments to be about women as a sex caste.
But you call her a gender critical feminist. She never said, she's actually actively said she's not a gender critical feminist. She's not a feminist. So
I know, I agree.
But you're saying you think she is.
My point is that their labels aside, what they are committed to in everything they say and do reveals what their commitments are, their own labels aside. And this is like saying a man is still a man, regardless of whether he tells you that he's a woman. I understand their reasons for not calling themselves feminists. They've got great reasons. They think that movement's turned to shit and they don't want to associate themselves with it. Doesn't mean they don't fit a particular description of a theory, which I think they do.
Yeah, and I think that probably might have been worth saying before you called them that. I think in terms of, okay, well, on page 119, you just sort of drop in that they're called that you call them.
Yeah, I think earlier I do. I'm almost certain that I do, because I was aware of this when I was writing. Yeah.
And then the other thing is that, I've just got a long list of questions. You call Julie Bindel a radical feminist. And now what's interesting is last year, her book, Feminism is for Everyone, sort of made this idea. She started saying, look, I'm a feminist, and moving away from defining herself as a radical feminist, which I think is really interesting that she's moved away from that. And I suppose we're trying to have a conversation about what we think is right in feminism and what are the correct analyses. And her sort of maneuver, I suppose, was to say, I'm going to take control of the definition of feminism. And I don't think that works. I think that I just think it's a bit like this other bit that I really like that you've quoted in, on page 40, you quote J.K. Rowling's, the center of her book, Troubled Blood, where the main character, Strike, says to a student activist, reclaim language all you fucking like. You don't change real world attitudes by deciding slurs aren't derogatory, which is a bit, I totally love that. And I love it that you put that in, because it's like, it's J.K. Rowling knowing she's gone right to the heart of the matter. You can do what you want with language, but if everybody else doesn't do it. And I sort of don't really think that it works with Julie Bindel saying feminism is what she says it is and everybody's meant to come in line. And I sort of don't really agree with you making this gambit to do. I mean, I think it's good that it's done, but I don't agree with what you've done, with the way you've defined it, that you're sort of saying this is what gender critical feminism is, and you're defining all these other people in ways that they're not necessarily defining themselves.
Yeah, but do you see the relation to the trans? It's like, do we respect the way people want to label themselves, or do we respect their actions and behaviors and words? It seems to me that the right classification is what their views reveal of their position, not their preferred labels. So that's one thing. Yeah. Julie Bindel's, I think that move, she's put that to me recently in talking about the book, and I absolutely take the point. I mean, her and a few others were sort of objecting, why is it called gender critical feminism? Because you sort of concede the point that this is a a type or a marginal feminism rather than the feminism. And, you know, McKinnon made that move much earlier, right? We have feminism unmodified is radical feminism. It's not, all that other stuff is kind of something else. And I do see the pull to do that. Like, we want to fight for feminism, the word, because we are the ones that are sort of doing it properly. But on the other hand, I think, oh, what a fight. Like, I sort of am kind of okay with conceding that because women is such a huge group, we are going to think differently about what our movement needs to be. And I just don't know if I'm up for that fight of like denying the pluralism, like wanting to fight for the one true feminism rather than just saying, yeah, there's rad femmes and socialist femmes and there's all these intersectional femmes and it's all interesting. And I just want us to have a constructive conversation about it rather than this toxic accusation that one of it is bigotry.
And what about going on to another thing? You said that you're saying that the roots of gender critical feminism are in radical feminism. I can imagine loads of socialist feminists and liberal feminists, like loads of non-feminists, women who have come to this and describe themselves as gender critical, are going to disagree because they see that they're coming to criticism of the transgender ideology is coming from somewhere totally different. Have you talked to any of them about any women before you did this, that they actually agree that the roots are in radical feminism?
I talked to a lot of women before I got banned from Twitter and in developing my ideas. That's when I still had a large gender critical and radical feminist network. I kept that for a while longer because I think I wasn't on Facebook for about another year, and I was in a large radical feminist group, but Australia based. So to the extent that I had access, I did try to sort of make sure I was representing the movement as far as I thought I could within the bounds of thinking this stuff through myself, except for on intersectionality, where I just went rogue.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think so. But I also want, part of the argument is also supposed to be that that it causes a bit of a realization, right? So maybe for some women who just care about trans and are talking about the importance of sex and not getting rid of these words and caring about women, they haven't really thought yet that that's actually got a strong link back to this other project and that they're in a lineage, but maybe they realize that once you present that to them.
Yeah.
So then they wouldn't need to agree, right? They would just need to see it once you persuaded them.
When I read this, I'm so lucky I've read the transcripts, whatever, the pre-thing. I was thinking, right, this is going to really annoy the socialist feminists. It's going to annoy the radical feminists. It's going to annoy loads of people that you've mentioned. It's going to annoy the lib fems. And of course, the trans rights activists are going to be livid. And I think one reason they're going to be livid, and I'm really pleased you've done the book, is that they don't want any of this defined. They don't want there to be a logical, coherent definitions. Like, even if I don't agree with some of your definitions and some of the argumentation, the trans rights activists absolutely don't want this written down. And so what it is it's something that just the very act of making a logical argument that unpicks some of their totally incoherent arguments is going to really annoy them. And is it right they tried to get it banned, or they've tried to get Oxford University not to print it? Oxford University Press.
There were two recent petitions. One was by the OUP Guild in the US, and I'm not sure I still don't know what the OUP Guild is. Maybe it's some collection of
union, I think.
Yeah, of
American
current employees.
version of a union.
Yeah, right. Or past employees. Okay. So maybe it's employees in the US, but the branches are quite different. OUP UK and OUP US. For example, the US branch has deplatformed as too strong, but decided not to move forward with a volume because Kathleen and I would have been in it, right? Whereas the UK is much better on this. So there is a sort of value stuff difference between the two. And that guild, by the way, they put their petition up, but now the link is broken. So I'm not sure whether they just kind of didn't get enough interest and backed down, or what might have happened there. The bigger petition, which claims to have had about 900 legitimate signatures, or whatever exactly that means, they were never revealed to the public. That was kind of sent to OUP UK. And I think in the last week or so, is it, that they did an official response standing by the book. So that group was previous authors and people who did labor for OUP, like reviewing, or maybe had aspirations of publishing with them or something like that. So it was a loose community of sort of woke people who were disappointed that they were publishing this book. And to OUP, to their credit, have absolutely stood by the book, which is amazing.
Yeah. So I'm now going to move on to another thing. You on page 53, you mention Amy Stevens, who's a man, and he took his employers to court because he wanted to be seen as, he was planning to transition, and now you call Stevens her employer, that she was planning to transition. And there's another time when you, on page 103, I think it is, it's a couple of times, you use female pronouns, and then later on you make a very good statement about how we shouldn't use female pronouns, and then you say you might question why I've used female pronouns sometimes and not at other times, and you've said that it's because the publisher asked you to do it. Now, how can that be? How did that happen?
Yeah, I guess I'll just say that I think OUP reasonably projected that there would be controversy about the book, and they wanted to reduce that controversy as far as reasonably possible with allowing me to still express my views. And so there was a lot of wrangling, it's a slight understatement, about exactly the final wording of certain things. And one of the questions was this language about, when and if it's ever appropriate to refer to sex, what you're allowed to call people, real people / hypotheticals / whatever. Yeah. So I ended up having to make some compromises in order to have the book come out with that press. And I did agree to make those compromises.
But, I mean, the problem for us is it's not just you, it's us that are compromised. And well, it's the problem for everybody. That's if we want to get published, or if, your stuff gets, if this is the price that's paid, and we don't know what you believe. So it's a problem. And I mean, I suppose I'd like to ask, if it's possible, would you say that you are a gender critical feminist? So you would say you're not a radical feminist because of this? No. So are you both, or what? I'm
absolutely both. Yeah. And so I would prefer in my communications to use sex-based language. Nonetheless, I think the benefit of having a book on our theory and movement come out with OUP, cementing its place in the academy, which so far there's been massive gatekeeping, is more important than refusing to make concessions on the language and then having to publish with a tiny press where you cannot get your message out broadly. That's just a choice that I made.
Yeah, and it's similar to what Julie Vendel did last year. She talked to us about radical feminism, and she said a similar thing, that she has made compromises sometimes in order to get published, which we, is problematic. But you can understand your argument that you're getting out a long way. Yeah. Another thing that radical feminists will say when they read this is that you seem to have this idea that there are good trans, there are real trans, and wrong, that people can actually be trans, and radical feminists. So on, I don't know what page it's on, it says, what about the harms of refusing to affirm as trans people who are in fact trans? And that happens quite a lot. You use the term trans men, trans women, that radical feminists, that, as I understand it, are tending now, everybody tends to say men. So a bit later on, you say there were 8 trans women in the women's football team, and radical feminists are saying they're men. There are 8 men, and it makes a massive difference in terms of language. So do you actually believe that there are people who are trans?
I'm on the fence about whether there is a phenomenon of true trans that would apply to some extraordinarily tiny group of people, and where the rest of the people identifying that way have a completely different explanation, or whether all of it can kind of be explained away. I think it's clearly a kind of interactive kind where the idea has emerged and then people have thought it suited them and taken it up. But I also don't see why this is necessarily connected to radical feminism, because you can believe in a diagnostic category of true trans and talk about trans without that having any impact on your commitment to the sexes or your analysis of sex cast. So I don't think it's true that you can't be a radical feminist and believe in trans, even if lots of radical feminists today happen to decide that they don't believe in trans. And again, this is part of the things I'm trying to push in the book, which is this minimalist definition of radical feminism in terms of sex cast, where they're just all giving very interesting, different experimental answers to the questions we have about the explanations, the mechanisms, and the solutions. So if you agree with me that that's the definition, and many people may not, but if you do, there's plenty of space to have separate discussions about what's really going on with trans, which I'm very interested in.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say unfortunately we're coming to the end of our time, and thank you so much for answering those questions. And I mean, I feel like I loved reading what you wrote, and there's so many quotable bits in there. I've highlighted loads of bits, and I think they will come out as people read it. There's so many brilliant insights, and it's one of those books that when you read it, it gives you energy and you start thinking. So it sparks lots of ideas, and some of which, many of which I disagree with, but lots of it I agree with. And I think that it's really brilliant that you've come onto this and been willing to be questioned, and that we as radical feminists, gender critical feminists, or whatever we call ourselves, this is radical feminist perspective, so we tend to be radical feminists, but we are having a conversation and we're saying we can talk about this, and we've got hopefully probably quite similar objectives, but we're doing it differently. So that's my feeling about it. I think it's a big challenge that somebody should write an answer to this sort of radical feminism, because we've got Julie Bindel saying feminism is for everybody. We've got this now, gender critical feminism. So we need somebody hopefully to write radical feminism from the perspective I've been putting some of those points. So we've only got a minute or two, maybe go to Caroline and then back to you, Holly.
Can I just make a tiny correction?
Do. Absolutely.
That Bindel's book is Feminism for Women, right? So she is in
yes.
Yeah, just not to confuse it with the Bell Hooks line.
Thank you. Yeah.
Go, Caroline.
And the response from Kathleen Stock, and in the tradition of Michael Biggs, where they're now attempting to double down on gender as a category that we should support, and what their kind of response has been.
Sorry.
Oh, probably not. I just read Kathleen.
That was so fast.
Well treating in my own mind about it. But I think in response to your book specifically, or what's perceived of your book, that now we've got sort of on the other side of the radical feminists, a different political spectrum altogether, is people coming forward to sort of say, no, we can't be critical or abolitionist of gender. Instead, we have to retain gender as for its sort of social normative benefits. And so I don't know whether
I have a lot of things to say in response to that blog, and obviously we don't have time for them. But I guess the thing that I did take away from reading that was her second to last Substack, I think, was just that there is still a bit of unclarity about exactly what the content of gender is when we claim to be gender abolitionists. So when we say it, and I talked to Kate about this just before the webinar, to sort of like, oh, what do we think? I think we mean the content of masculinity and femininity as it is, as we see it now, right? So men should chop the firewood and not cry and that stuff. And Kathleen, when she was talking about it, she meant absolutely any social norm relating to sex in any possible future. And of course, I think the rad femmes now could agree that there might be some norms associated with sex in some future that are fine. And I think Kathleen would agree that lots of the content of masculinity and femininity now should be abolished. So we just need to find where is the actual disagreement between us on what she thinks is positive or would be infeasible to get rid of in that content now. And that's just a bigger conversation that I think she and we still need to have.
And yeah, and I think also it's so nice that we can have this conversation, and that we, in the spirit of listening to each other and thinking and moving forward, and it's sparking, you know, we'll get more clarity that we're all on journeys and understanding. Yeah. So I think it's been really fantastic. Hopefully some people will read the book, and we could possibly come back to this at some stage, because I guess there'll be lots written about this book. It's going to be important, and there'll be sort of positives and negatives, but it's been just really, really a pleasure. Thank you so much, Holly and Caroline, for coming on. And
thank you both.
Everybody being here. It's just really good that we're working on this all together. Okay, so we're going to finish the webinar. It will be on YouTube in about 4 or 5 hours. And there's a breakout room, so go to it if you want to.
Cool.
Thanks, Jo.
Okay, bye everyone.
Bye.